The sky was the color of rusted iron, and the wind carried the taste of dust and blood. The woman walked with her head bowed against the burning air, her shawl drawn tight around her face. The fabric had once been blue, but now it was the color of the desert, pale, frayed, and full of sorrow. 3 children trailed behind her, their faces smeared with sweat and dirt, their lips cracked open like dry earth. The smallest, a girl barely 5, stumbled with each step, whispering something too faint to be heard. The woman's name was Clara, though the desert did not care to know it. They had been walking since dawn, or what had passed for dawn in this endless waste. The wagon had broken 2 days before, an axle snapped on the stony rise beyond the riverbed. She had buried her husband beneath a stand of mesquite the same evening, his body already stiff by the time she found the strength to dig. He had been kind once, and she had loved him once. But death erases even tenderness. Now he was part of the dust that bit at her heels. The sun had grown into a cruel overseer by mid-morning, pressing down with weight enough to crush the soul. Clara's arms trembled from carrying the boy, her middle child, whose legs had given out the day before. His head lolled against her shoulder, feverish, murmuring of cool streams and the taste of milk. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 10, walked a few paces ahead, scanning the horizon with hollow eyes, pretending to be a man. His name was Samuel, and he carried his father's knife, though he did not yet know how to use it. By afternoon, the air itself seemed to shimmer with madness. Clara's vision swam. Shapes twisted on the horizon, hills, maybe, or mirages. Once she thought she saw a horse, then it vanished in the glare. Her breath came in dry, rasping gasps. She thought of the letter folded deep in her pack, the one addressed to a man she had never met, a rancher in the Southern Territories, an old friend of her husband's. She had carried it for weeks, meaning to deliver it. Now it seemed nothing more than paper, useless as prayer. Her knees buckled just as the wind shifted. She fell to the ground with the boy still in her arms, her knees striking rock. The pain was sharp, real, anchoring. The children cried out, but the sound was distant, hollow, like something made by ghosts. For a moment she considered staying there, just staying, letting the sun finish what it had begun. There was a strange peace in the thought, the kind that comes when all choices are gone. Then, through the blur of heat, she heard it, the slow, steady rhythm of hooves. A horse, not a mirage this time. It came from the west, dark against the dying light. The rider drew closer, a tall man on a bay mare, his hat pulled low, dust trailing behind like smoke. He reined in when he saw them, his silhouette cut clean against the red horizon. For a long moment, neither moved. The desert held its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. "You're far from anywhere, ma'am." Clara tried to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. The man dismounted and came nearer, his spurs whispering against the sand. He wore a worn duster and carried a rifle slung across his back. His eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, were the color of dried sage. The children stared at him, wide-eyed, uncertain whether he was salvation or another trial. He crouched beside Clara and held out a canteen. "Water," he said simply. She took it with shaking hands, the metal cool against her palms. The first swallow burned her throat, but she drank until the pain eased. The man watched, silent, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finally looked up, he nodded toward the horizon. "There's a ranch about half a day's ride south. We'll get you there." Quote, Clara wanted to ask why a stranger offering help when the world had long since turned cruel. But she saw something in his face that made the question unnecessary. Not kindness exactly, but recognition. The kind of look shared by 2 souls who had both known loss. He lifted the smallest child into his arms and motioned to Samuel. "You can walk beside the horse, son. Keep close." As they began to move again, Clara glanced back once. The desert stretched behind them, endless and silent. Her husband's grave lay somewhere beyond the dunes, already swallowed by wind. She turned away, gripping the reins as the mare started forward. For the first time in days, the light ahead seemed to soften, not forgiving, not gentle, but alive. The mare's rhythm settled into Clara's bones, a slow rocking that pulled tears from the corners of her eyes without asking permission. The man walked beside them with the reins in his hand, step for step with the children. His boots left neat prints that the wind tried to erase and failed. The smallest girl slept against his shoulder, mouth open, making soft sounds like a thirsty bird. Samuel kept a wary distance, glancing at the rifle, then at the canteen on Clara's lap, then back to the horizon as if daring it to break. Heat peeled away with the sinking light. The breeze came thin and tin-smelling, like water remembered rather than found. The man said little. When he did speak, his words were plain and carried the wear of use. He asked the boy his name, and asked if the fevered child had breathed easier since drinking, and he said there would be shade soon. Nothing else. It felt like März. Twice, Clara's throat clenched with the urge to tell him everything. She felt it rise like a cry does, raw and sudden. Yet what was there to tell except that a good thing had ended and the world had not stopped to notice? She had watched her husband cough out the last of his air while the sun slid down the sky, as if hurrying to a more interesting show. They reached the dry cut of a wash and followed it, as if walking down a long throat, the banks honeycombed by wind. Mesquite crowded the edges, green as sin and salvation. The man paused, scanned the ground, and pointed with 2 fingers. Hoof marks, fresh, more than one set, crossing south. He nodded, as if greeted by old acquaintances. They stopped where a cottonwood dragged a rag of shade over the sand. He laid the girl beneath it and gave Samuel a task, quiet and sure. Gather sticks no bigger than your thumb. Check those low branches for pods. Keep your blade folded unless you need it. The boy straightened at the word blade, pretending he had not been drawing the knife partway just to feel the weight. Clara washed the fevered child's face with the last of the canteen and a scrap of dress torn from her hem. The child sighed and slept deeper, mouth slack with trust. Clara's hands were cracked and blood-lined from days of pulling, lifting, digging. The sting of water felt clean. When she looked up, the man was watching her with a kind of quiet attention that made no claim. She searched his face for a cruelty she could understand and found none. Only weariness and the small patience of someone who had walked a long time alone. "Your boy will need broth," he said. "We'll make a thin one from mesquite pods tonight. It will sit easy." She nodded, surprised by relief so simple it almost hurt. They walked again as the day dimmed. The children drifted in and out of a silence that held them like a net. Clara's mind loosened. In the swell and dip of the mare's back she felt the talk of the past come unlatched, and memory opened like a door too long swollen by rain. She saw the kitchen of a house that no longer stood, the boards thirsty for oil, the morning glaze of sunlight across a tin basin. Her husband laughing with a handful of flour in his beard, then later quiet, tracing the letter with his finger as if reading raised script. A name on the page, the rancher to the south, a friend from a time before her. "We will go there," he had said. He had not said why he could no longer stay where he was. She had not asked. Some questions have answers that grow thorns. The man caught her looking at the canteen and lifted it with a small motion. She drank, passed it to Samuel, watched the boy take the briefest swallow and hand it back to her. The desert teaches frugality as a mother teaches manners. She touched his head and found heat still there, but not raging. Her shoulders eased one notch. Night came on like a slow mercy. The man led them off the wash and up a low rise where the ground showed grass tough as rope. On its back sat a small line of cottonwoods and, beyond them, fence wire. The silhouettes of a house and barn lay against the last light, humble as folded hands. "Home," he said. And the word was so soft, it almost broke. A dog barked once, then again. A woman's lantern flared on the porch. The man raised his arm and the lantern tilted in reply. By the time Clara reached the steps, her legs were singing with pain. The woman stood in the doorframe, sturdy, hair-braided, eyes sharp and not unkind. She took the fevered child from Clara without comment. The house smelled of smoke and fat and something green hanging to dry. The dog lay down after a ceremonial sniff at Samuel's boots. Inside, warmth ached. The man hung his hat and washed his hands in a wooden bowl, careful as prayer. Clara sat at the table and kept her back straight so she would not fold into the wood and disappear. The woman ladled broth into tin mugs and set them down like gifts. The children drank with the seriousness of church. Clara sipped and felt the salt wake her tongue. The man ate last. When the boy's eyes lidded, the woman pointed to a pallet by the hearth and spoke with the same plain grace as the man. "You and the little one there. The girl beside you." She looked to Clara. "You too, once you can lie without shame at stopping." Clara did not lie. She sat at the table and wrapped her hands around the empty mug as if it could be warmed by memory. The man moved toward the door, then paused, hand on the frame. "My name is Abel." He said it like an old debt finally settled. Clara let air fill her chest and leave. "Thank you," she said, and felt how small and heavy the words could be at once. He nodded, as if to say there would be more to it later, and stepped into the night. The night passed without dreams, only the slow rhythm of breathing the children's, the dog's, her own. When morning came, it crept through the cracks of the window like a shy visitor. Pale light caught the dust motes in the air and made them shimmer, tiny worlds adrift in stillness. Clara lay awake before the others, listening. Somewhere outside, a windmill groaned and turned, creaking like an old man's knees. The smell of coffee and damp earth drifted through the open door. She rose quietly, stepping over the children, who had curled into one another during the night. Her limbs ached, but the pain felt clean, not like the hollow ache of hopelessness. She found the basin on the porch, water dark from use, and washed her face. The cold bit her skin awake. When she looked up, Abel was already there, leaning against a post, a tin cup in his hand, hat pulled low. "Mornin'," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mornin'," she answered, voice rough from disuse. He offered her the cup. "There's more inside. You look like you could use it." She hesitated, then took it. The coffee was strong and bitter, the kind that leaves grit on the tongue. It was perfect. They stood a while without speaking. The horizon stretched wide, washed in the faint pink of early day. Beyond the pasture, a line of cattle moved slow as smoke, and the sound of hooves carried faintly across the wind. Abel's dog trotted past, nose to the ground, circling the yard as if counting what still lived. "How long were you out there?" he asked finally. 3 days, maybe 4, she said. "Feels like longer." He nodded. "It always does." He motioned toward the barn. "There's work to be done if you're of a mind. Not much, but it'll keep your hands steady." She almost said no, but something in his tone, plain, without pity, made refusal impossible. "I can work," she said. By mid-morning, she was mending harness straps with the rancher's wife, whose name was Ruth. The woman moved with brisk purpose, all economy and quiet strength. They spoke little, except when instruction was needed. Clara found comfort in that silence, in the steady rhythm of the awl through leather, the smell of oil and dust. It reminded her of her husband's tool shed before sickness had taken him, before everything had turned brittle. Samuel helped Abel with the horses, eyes sharp and cautious. Clara watched him through the open barn door, watched how Abel spoke to him not as a child, but as a man in the making. He showed him how to brush the mare, how to check her hooves, how to move slow so she'd trust his hands. Samuel listened without words, the way boys do when they've known too much loss too young. At noon, Ruth called them in for bread and stew. The table was plain pine, scrubbed white by years of use. Abel sat across from Clara, his hat on the floor beside him. The children ate with quiet fervor, their spoons clinking like small bells. When the bowls were empty, Ruth poured water into tin cups, and the sound filled the still room like music. Afterward, Abel walked her down to the pasture. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sweetness of wild sage. He showed her where the land rose toward the distant ridges, where the cattle roamed, where the creek once ran before it dried to a scar of cracked mud. "This land don't forgive easy," he said, "but it remembers kindness." She looked at him, unsure if he was speaking to her or himself. They worked side by side the rest of the afternoon, mending fence line. The sun blazed down, yet it no longer felt cruel, only honest. Abel moved with quiet precision, every motion purposeful, like a man who had learned to survive by listening to what the land refused to give freely. As they worked, he told her small things, how he'd come to this place years ago, after his brother was killed in a cattle raid, how he'd built the ranch from near nothing with Ruth, and her husband, Ruth's husband, who had since died of fever. His voice carried no embellishment, no plea for sympathy, just the truth. offered plain as dry bread. Clara listened. Each word seemed to carve space inside her where numbness had been. She realized she hadn't spoken her husband's name since the burial, not once. And still, she could feel the memory of his hand on hers, the calluses, the warmth, the weight of years, spent together in silence more than in speech. By evening, the fence stood mended, a rough line against the horizon. Abel leaned on a post, looking out toward the setting Sunday. The light caught in his eyes, and for the first time she saw something there that wasn't just weariness. It was hope, or maybe its distant cousin, something quieter and less certain. "Storm coming tomorrow," he said. "You'll stay till it passes." Clara wanted to protest, to say she couldn't stay, that the road ahead still called. But she looked toward the children, Samuel helping Ruth with the wash, the little ones chasing the dog through the dust, and she said only, "All right." He nodded once, as if he'd expected no other answer. Then he turned toward the barn, his shadow stretching long across the ground. That night, as thunder whispered far off, Clara lay awake listening to the steady breathing of her children, the creak of wood, the sigh of the wind through the chinks. For the first time in a long while, she didn't think of leaving. She thought of roots, fragile but reaching, and of the way kindness can take shape even in a place that should have long since forgotten it. The storm rolled in before dawn, slow and deliberate, like a creature testing its strength. The first drop struck the roof with hollow patience, then gathered into a steady rhythm. The sound filled the small house, steady as a heartbeat. Clara lay still, her eyes open to the darkness, listening to the rain spread across the land. It had been months since she'd heard it true rain, not the mocking drizzle that vanished before touching ground. The scent of wet earth seeped in through the cracks, rich and new. When she rose, the others were already awake. Ruth tended the fire, her hair unbound, the lines on her face softened by the glow. Abel sat by the window, rolling a cigarette he never lit. He looked up when Clara stepped into the room, his eyes a darker shade than the morning. "Ground'll drink deep today," he said. She nodded, drawing her shawl around her shoulders. "Feels like the desert's been holding its breath too long." The two women worked side by side that morning, patching sacks, cleaning the pantry, setting aside jars that needed boiling once the rain filled the cistern. The air inside the house felt dense, alive with the quiet of those who have found something worth keeping. Outside, Samuel helped Abel mend a gate that had sagged in the night. The sound of hammer against wood carried through the rain like a steady pulse. Ruth spoke once, her voice low but certain. "He don't bring many folks here." Clara looked up. "Your husband?" Ruth shook her head. "Abel. He's seen too much go. Lost his brother, then his folks, then this land near lost him too. He stayed when most would have gone. Never said why." Clara folded a sack and set it aside. Maybe he didn't need a reason. Ruth studied her for a moment, the corners of her mouth softening. "Maybe you understand him more than you think." By midday, the rain eased. The world outside glistened, every rock and blade of grass caught light in its own small way. Clara stepped onto the porch, her boots sinking into the soft ground. The air smelled clean, sharp with sage. The children were chasing puddles, their laughter echoing in the open space between clouds. She felt it then, sudden and fierce, the ache of hope. It startled her, fragile and dangerous as glass. Abel approached from the barn, his hat dripping. He carried a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Found this in the loft," he said. "Old blankets. Thought you might use 'em. Thank you." He hesitated, then leaned against the porch post. "Storm'll break by tomorrow. If you're still set on traveling south, I'll see you as far as the crossing." She turned toward the fields where the cattle moved like shadows against the wet earth. "I don't know that I am set on anything anymore." The admission hung between them, soft but heavy. He nodded once, as though he understood it perfectly. The rain began again, lighter now, whispering against the porch roof. That evening, Ruth called them all to supper. The meal was plain beans, salt pork, and fresh bread, but it felt rich as a feast. The children spoke between mouthfuls, their voices carrying warmth into corners that had known too much silence. Abel sat across from Clara again, his hands clean but rough, his forearms marked by years of sun and work. She found herself watching the small gestures, the way he tore the bread, the way he listened before he spoke. After the plates were cleared, he rose. "Come," he said, nodding toward the door. She followed him into the dusk. The sky was clearing, stars beginning to pierce through the thinning clouds. They walked beyond the barn, where the ground dipped into a shallow gully. The air was cool, the world hushed except for the croak of a frog somewhere unseen. Abel stopped beside a small wooden cross half hidden by grass. "My brother," he said, "buried him myself. It was a bad year. Lost cattle, lost men. He was just 20 when he died." Clara stood beside him, her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest. "I buried mine too," she whispered. "A husband, not a brother. Though it feels the same when you're left behind." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "The leaving never stops hurting, but you find a way to make it mean something. Else, it takes you with it." She looked down at her hands, the scars and calluses, the small tremors of exhaustion. "I thought if I kept moving, it wouldn't find me." "Hazit?" She didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. They stood there until the last light faded, until the first stars gathered like dust across the dark. Then Abel turned to her. "Stay a while, Clara. Don't have to call it forever. Just stay until you remember what peace feels like." The words settled in her like warmth spreading through cold limbs. She wanted to say yes, but all she managed was a small nod, barely a breath. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture both farewell and promise, then walked back toward the house. She remained, staring at the cross, the earth still damp from rain. For the first time since her husband's death, she knelt and prayed not for rescue, not for forgiveness, but for courage to belong again. When she rose, the stars were bright enough to see her way back. The windows of the house glowed soft and golden. Through them, she could see her children asleep by the fire, Ruth knitting beside the hearth, Abel's shadow moving slow across the room. Something inside her shifted small but certain. The days that followed carried a gentler rhythm, though the land still wore its harshness like armor. The rain had broken the earth open, coaxing small green shoots from the soil, stubborn things that refused to die. Clara rose early each morning to help Ruth with the milking, her fingers learning the weight and patience of the task. The barn was cool and dim at dawn, full of sounds both quiet and alive, the steady drip of milk, the rustle of hay, the creak of wood. Abel passed by most mornings, checking tack, tending to fences. He moved with an ease that came from long familiarity with labor, the kind that requires no thinking, only endurance. Clara found comfort in watching him, not out of longing, but recognition. Here was someone who knew the language of survival without needing to speak it. Samuel had taken to following him everywhere. Abel never told the boy what to do outright. Instead, he showed him, letting Samuel learn by mimicry and silence. Clara watched as her son grew surer with a rope, quicker with his hands, his shoulders straightening under the Sunday. He still flinched at sudden noise, still woke from dreams with a gasp, but the fear no longer owned him entirely. In the afternoons, Ruth and Clara shelled beans on the porch, while the younger children played in the yard. Ruth spoke of the old days, when the ranch had been only a half-built dream shared by 3 families who believed in hard soil and mercy. Clara listened, letting the older woman's words fill the hollow places inside her. Once, Ruth said quietly, "When a woman's lost enough, she stops fearing what's ahead. She just starts building again, like there's no choice." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe that's all courage is." Ruth nodded. "Maybe." It was on the 5th evening that Abel brought a gift, a small wooden comb carved by hand, the teeth smooth and even. "For the little one," he said, setting it on the table. "Her hair catches the wind like it means to leave." Clara ran her thumb along the wood, tracing the faint groove where his knife had slipped. "You made this?" He shrugged, embarrassed. "Had time enough last winter." She met his eyes. "It's beautiful." Something in his expression shifted, something soft and unguarded. "Glad to hear it." After supper, while Ruth put the children to bed, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, the sky streaked with violet and ash. She could hear the windmill turning slow and steady, the whisper of grass bending beneath it. Abel sat at the edge of the porch, rolling another cigarette he did not light. "I used to think," she said, her voice low, that if I just kept walking, I'd find some place where the pain couldn't follow. But it always did. It's quieter now, though. Abel nodded. It don't disappear. Just learns to sit down beside you. They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that asks nothing in return. She looked out toward the darkening horizon and thought of the grave beneath the mesquite, already hidden by sand. It no longer felt like an open wound, more like a scar still tender, but closed. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain still lingering in the soil. She breathed it in, slow and full. "Abel," she said after a while, "why did you stop me that day? You didn't know me. Could have ridden on." He leaned back, eyes fixed on the distance. "Because you looked like someone who'd already been left too many times. And because once, someone stopped for me." Clara turned to him. "Ruth?" He smiled faintly. "Her husband first. Found me half dead in a gulch after a raid. Carried me back here. Never said a word about it after. Just put me to work. Guess I learned from that." She looked down at her hands, at the small cracks mended by time and care. "Maybe we keep each other alive that way, one mercy at a time." He nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "Maybe that's all any of this is." A quiet settled over them, deep and unbroken. Fireflies blinked at the edges of the yard, small lanterns of the unseen. From inside she could hear her daughter murmuring in sleep, Samuel shifting near the hearth. Abel stood after a while, dusted his palms against his trousers. "There's room here, Clara. Not just for a night or a storm. For more, if you'll have it." Her breath caught. She turned to him, the words caught somewhere between fear and hope. "I don't know if I remember how to stay." He met her gaze. "Then learn here with us." She didn't answer. But when he reached for his hat, she caught his hand lightly, her fingers cold against his warmth. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to still, the wind, the grass, even the stars. When he finally walked away toward the barn, she stayed on the porch long after, her hand resting where his had been. The night hummed softly around her, full of unseen things taking root, and though she didn't speak it aloud, she knew. She would not leave in the morning. The following weeks unfurled with the quiet rhythm of labor and light. The days began before sunrise, when the air still held a trace of coolness, and the hills glowed faintly like embers left from some forgotten fire. Clara learned to read the land the way the soil darkened before rain, the calls of birds that warned of weather turning, the subtle shift in cattle when a predator wandered too close. Each morning her hands grew steadier, her breath surer. Abel and Samuel worked the far pasture most days, riding out before the first color touched the sky. Clara watched them go from the porch, the figures small against the widening light. Her heart would lift, then settle again in her chest. The fear that had once ruled her of loss, of distance, of the world's indifference did not vanish, but it loosened its grip, like a hand unclenching. Ruth said little about the way things had changed, though her eyes missed nothing. She moved with the slow patience of someone who had seen years come and go like wind through the same stretch of grass. Now and then, she would glance at Clara across the table and give a knowing smile, neither kind nor cruel, but full of understanding. One afternoon, Ruth pressed a folded piece of paper into Clara's hand. "Found this by the stove," she said. "Looks to be yours." Clara opened it. The letter creased, weather-worn, the one she had carried through the desert. Her husband's handwriting, careful but fading. She had not read it since the day he'd sealed it. She took it outside, sat beneath the cottonwood, and unfolded it with trembling fingers. "My old friend," it began, "if this letter reaches you, I am likely gone. I send my wife and children your way. She is stronger than she knows, but the world has not been gentle with her. Whatever kindness you can spare, know that I will be grateful, even in death." The words blurred. Clara lowered the page, pressing it to her chest. The sky above her was clear, the air sharp with light. Her husband's voice, so far away now, still carried the same wish, that she might find safe ground. Abel approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused when he saw her sitting there, the letter open on her lap. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You didn't," she answered softly. "It's his writing. He meant for us to find you." He took a slow breath, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Then I reckon he knew what he was doing. She smiled faintly through the ache. He did one thing right, at least. Abel crouched beside her, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. You loved him, yes. The word was small but sure, and I grieved him. But grief changes, doesn't it? Turns from a wound to something quieter. He nodded. It does if you let it. A silence stretched between them, soft as the shade. Clara folded the letter and tucked it back into her dress pocket. He wanted me to find life again. I think I might have. Abel looked at her, then really looked, as though seeing her for the first time not as the woman he'd found in the desert, but as someone who had survived it. You already have, he said. That evening the sky broke open into colors, rose, gold, violet, spilling over the plains. The children chased the dog through the grass, their laughter rising against the wind. Ruth sat on the porch, sewing, her needle catching what little light remained. Abel joined Clara at the fence line. The air smelled of rain far off, of wild sage and dust. He leaned his arms on the top rail, watching the horizon. There's talk of driving cattle north before the next dry spell, he said. Could use another pair of hands if you're staying. She glanced at him. If? He smiled, faint but certain. Seems only fair to ask. I'll stay, she said simply. Not because I owe it to anyone, because I want to. Abel turned his gaze toward her, the faintest warmth rising in his eyes. Then that's the right reason. For a long while they stood without speaking, the evening wind brushing past, carrying the sound of laughter from the yard. The world felt wide again, not as threat or exile, but as promise. Later, after the children had gone to sleep, Clara stepped outside one last time. The moon was high, silvering the fields. She could see the faint glimmer of dew along the fence, the low outline of the barn where Abel still worked by lamplight. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the wagon broken, the desert endless, the thirst that had nearly undone her. Yet in that same unforgiving land, she had found something unexpected. Not salvation exactly, but steadiness. She whispered into the quiet, to no one and everyone, we made it. The wind stirred the grass as if in answer. When she turned back toward the house, the door stood open, light spilling onto the ground, a warm, steady glow against the night. And in that glow, she saw her future, humble and hard-earned, waiting.